So now that we have watched Darwin's struggle video, seen how he went about coming up with his theory of evolution and then writing his book and doing today's activity, we are going to look more closely at Darwin's Voyage and look at 3 different patterns that he noticed after collecting all of his species and specimens. So before we get started with that, let's talk about when Charles Darwin was born. It was February 12th, 1809. This was a good time for him to be born. It was a good time because at this moment, there were more scientists coming forward. They were looking at the world differently. They noticed that things were not always constant in the natural world. There was still a lot of religious thinking going on, but there were people who were trying to move from that and give different explanations. Most notably were geologists. They were suggesting that Earth was much older than they thought, and it had been changing over time. It was not always the same. With this, as Charles Darwin went through his journey, collected all the specimens, he came up with his theory of biological evolution. The definition we will be using is that evolution is going to be the change over time. And this is going to explain how modern organisms evolved over long periods of time through descent from common ancestors. So what does this mean? This means that the animals that we see now did not always look the same as they did in the past, and we're talking maybe hundreds, thousands, millions of years ago. And so over time, these long periods of time, like I said, thousands, millions of years, they did change. And then when we look at the descent from common ancestors, this is saying that there are lots of species that share many similar characteristics, and it probably means that somewhere millions of years ago, there is an ancestor that was common to both of them, and then they split off and created new species. So looking at his journey, you can see his journey is in the purple, and you can see the arrows as to which direction he went. You can see that he also traveled around the world, staying close to the coastlines. This voyage was 5 years. It started in 1831, and it was on the HMS Beagle. The actual reason for the voyage was that the crew was mapping the coastline of South America, so it was more of a mapping expedition. However, Darwin was given permission to come aboard, and every time they stopped or what he could see off of the ship when he was close to the coast, he made observations of. And these observations is what led to his actual theories, his conclusions, his hypotheses. And so every time he was able to stop, he collected specimens of plants, animals, he did drawings, he made lots of observations. So when he was actually on the HMS Beagle, he was able to make observations as they were traveling, but when he got a chance to stop, he would actually leave the ship and go and collect specimens that he could and bring back other specimens he could only make observations with. So for example, one trip that he did was to the Brazilian forest, and in this trip he actually was able to bring back 68 species of just beetles. From this, he was able to make drawings, he was able to make detailed observations. So he just filled notebooks full of observations. He looked at characteristics, he looked at the habitats, he looked at multiple different species. This also included plant species. Anything he couldn't bring aboard, he definitely was writing notes out in the field so that he could put them into his journals into an organized fashion. But after looking at all of his observations, he noticed 3 patterns. 1 is that species vary globally, 2 is that species vary locally, and 3 species can vary over time. So the first one we're going to look at is species varying globally. You can see pictured there are 3 animals that are different species, but they do look similar. In this example, we're going to talk about his visits to South America, Australia, and Africa, and what he found was that there were flightless ground-dwelling birds in South America. So these guys right here are going to be the rheas. This is what he found in South America, and so they look like ostriches. They don't fly. They are very large birds. Here is an actual ostrich. These are found in Africa only. And then this guy here is the emu, and he lives in Australia only. And so what he found was that even though there are different places across the globe, so South America, Australia, and Africa, very different places, he was finding that he found species that were similar yet different. So he found that different species, even ones that were similar like these three, inhabited separate habitats around the globe, even though some of these habitats were similar. So what he was seeing is that as he traveled, he saw a variety of organisms depending on where he was at. Another example of this is that he found a specific type of rabbit that lived in European grasslands, but he did not find them in South America or Australia. When he was in Australia, they also had grasslands, but they were different than anywhere else he had seen. And in this, he found that there were kangaroos. So that's what I have pictured here. And these kangaroos were only found in Australia, not anywhere else. And in Europe, there were only rabbits that he was seeing in that area, and the grasslands were different. So once again, everywhere he traveled, he found different types of species in either different or similar habitats. When we look at locally, he also saw that within a specific area that there were species that were different even in the same area. So, for example, when he was in South America, he found that there were 2 different species of rayas living there. There were 2 different habitats. There were the Argentinia's grasslands, and then there was also a colder, harsher grass and scrubland to the south. So one was warmer, one was colder, and he found that, yes, they were both rayas, but they were 2 subspecies. So they were different. They had adapted to the different environments. He also noticed that they were different but very relatable, or they looked like they would be the same species, occupied different habitats within a local area. So in this example, we're going to talk about tortoises. So here I've got 3 different types of tortoises. I have domed, intermediate, and saddle. They are all types of tortoises, but they are different species. So they lived in the same area, but in slightly different habitats so that they could all survive. Mockingbirds were the same, and finches. So each one of these lived in a similar area, but in a different habitat that they had evolved to be successful in. And then lastly, species also vary over time. So Darwin, as he was voyaging, he also was collecting fossils, not just living organisms or species. And what he noticed was that there were some fossils that he found that the animals were no longer alive, so they were extinct, but they were very similar to species we see today. One example of this is this glyptodont. You can see here on the far left, was a very large animal. In the middle is a picture of what the fossil would look like, and then to the right is the modern day armadillo. So the armadillo is very similar to the glyptodont. Size-wise, it's much smaller, but you can see it has the same kind of armor, tail, feet pattern. The head looks slightly different, but they definitely look like they are probably related in some way, probably millions of years ago, have a common ancestor, but the glyptodont went extinct, whereas the armadillo continued to evolve and survive and adapt. So different species, even though they are different, they do vary over time depending on if they are able to evolve and adapt to the new environment. So, to conclude, if we put all the pieces together, we discover that Darwin was actually stunned by all of his findings. He wasn't sure what he would find, and he then began to wonder that if there were different species on specifically the Galapagos, which he spent about 5 weeks at, could they have come from other ancestors? So specifically, he was looking at South American ancestors. From this, he spent years researching, filling notebooks with ideas. He wrote, once again, different observations and characteristics of species and how they could connect and what kind of evolution occurred. And then after making all of these observations, his conclusion was that he thought he had evidence to suggest that species were not fixed. That means they weren't the same as they always were, and that they could actually change, and this was a natural process. It wasn't something that was forced, it just happened. And so that was how he came up with his evolution theory, and then he wrote his book about it.